fight like any other recently. Little did I know it would be the last fight we'd ever have. Our fight was about grades. They were usually about grades. He'd been heading out the door, dressed to go hang out in the woods with the little felons he called friends. I suspected they were out there drinking, and I was absolutely sure they were out there smoking. I was tired of cleaning up after him and watching him slip slowly into delinquency. He told me he'd be back, and I told him to stop and come back and have a seat instead. He glowered at me from the front door, knowing what I wanted to talk about and not liking it. He slammed the door and came to sit on the couch, knowing he was about to sit down for another ass chewing. His grades had come in. They were the worst they had ever been. When I told him this, he said it wasn't his fault. Sighed. It was never his fault. Nothing was ever his fault. There was always someone else to blame, someone else to point the finger at, and it was never on him. This was old ground. We had treaded again and again and again. He would have to repeat the 11th grade at this rate. He didn't care. I told him he'd have to quit his job if he couldn't keep his grades up. He didn't care about that either. I would snatch everything but his air, his car, his games, his computer, everything, I finally blurted. And that was what struck a chord. That was the stroke that finally got through to him. Mom never had to stoop to this. Mom always knew a better way than to just punish me all the time. He had said exactly what I needed to hear to lose my temper too. Well, she isn't here, is she, Marcus? She's dead, or have you forgotten? I could see by his pained expression that I had touched a nerve. How could either of us forget that little fact? It just hadn't felt like home without her. We had done a lot of fighting, a lot of staying cooped up in our rooms and not talking so we really didn't have to deal with each other, and a lot of bottling up our hurt and just letting it fester. She had always kept us from escalating to this level of argument. Arguments that were beginning to approach the cusp of violence, I was starting to believe. My wife had been the pillar that held up our relationship, and it seemed that without her, it was starting to crumble. My wife had been dead for 3 months, and it had been the worst 3 months of my life. She died very suddenly, and the EMTs told me, totally painlessly. She had been turning into the grocery parking lot to do her weekly shopping when a city bus had hit her. Her car had rolled 4 times before coming to a rest against a tree. She had died when the driver's side door hit the tree, and they claimed she didn't suffer. I can't remember when I'd gotten the phone call, sitting at my desk at home and finishing up edits on another novel. I had given bad news to spouses like this 1,000 times when I was on the force, but it's different when that kind of horror visits you personally. We buried her in the family plot, and the two of us had went home to make the most of the home we had left. We had fought bitterly nearly every day since. I saw Marcus tear up and turned away before he could see that my eyes were filling too. "I hate you," he said. I wish I'd been in that car with her." That took me back for a moment, and I answered out of anger before I could even stop myself. "Sometimes I wish you had too." We were silent for a solid minute before he got up and walked slowly towards the hallway. "Don't bother worrying about me anymore. Maybe I'll go talk to Mom, see if she wants to listen." Then he stomped down the hallway and slammed his door behind him, leaving me alone to feel like the shittiest parent in the world. I spent the next few hours bustling about to distract myself. I made dinner, folded some laundry, and generally picked up as dinner boiled and simmered. When it finally finished, I assembled it on a plate and took it to the door of his room, intending it to be a peace offering. "Marcus," I called softly, knocking on the door and leaning close to listen. The other side of the door was quiet, not a sound, but I thought I could hear the creak of the mattress as its occupant rolled over. I sighed. He was ignoring me. That made me angry. I was trying to extend an olive branch here, and he was ignoring me. "Well, dinner's in the fridge when you decide to stop being mad," I said. His dinner went in the fridge, and I decided to flip on the Xbox and try to block out his childish behavior. I was still playing when I heard his door creak open, and the light footsteps he always used when he was trying to sneak out of his room. I ignored him as he scuttled up the hallway, clearly checking to see if I was in the living room. It had gotten dark a few hours ago. A check of the time showed me it was 10 o'clock, and I was a little angry that he was still awake. As he crossed behind the couch, I told him to get his food and go to bed. "You don't need to stay up all night." He didn't say anything. He just scuttled off to his room and closed the door, his food still in the fridge. Now I went back to playing my game. About an hour later, I took myself off to bed. I locked my door, just in case, but I wasn't expecting any trouble. My son was a hothead, just like his old man, but he wasn't usually violent. He was a good kid, but it was hard to see the good under all that yelling. I wish now that I had looked harder. Maybe I could have prevented what came next. The next day was Saturday, and I spent the day cleaning and catching up on things. I didn't see my son all day. He didn't come out for meals or just to ask me if he could have any of the myriad of things I'd taken away for the weekend. It wasn't out of the ordinary for him to try to pester me to get some of his stuff back. Last summer, he would stay up all night, and we'd never seen him until one morning when he got a wild hair to wake up early. After last night, I was a little glad he didn't come out. I didn't really want to see him, and his silence was kind of nice. When noon rolled around and I hadn't heard a toilet flush or a footstep creak across the floor, I became a little concerned. I went to his door and knocked, calling his name, expecting to hear some response. There was nothing, not a sound from inside. I started to feel angry again. I remembered how he had iced me out the night before, and left without saying anything. If he wanted to play this silent treatment game, so could I. I didn't think about it again until I was getting ready for bed, his door still not having rattled all day. I showered, took my sleeping pill, and went to bed. Getting comfy down under the covers, I started to think that maybe I should be more concerned. Was he sick? Was he hurt? Perhaps he was just waiting for me to apologize so we could go back to even footing. I had got half out of bed before my anger flared up again. He just wanted me to be the first one to crack. I rolled back into bed, putting the pillow over my head, and tried to fall asleep. I wasn't going to play these games with him. I awoke in the middle of the night to a loud crashing noise in the kitchen. I was next to the bed in a heartbeat, police training taking over, despite it being years since I was on the force. I reached under the bed, finding the box that held my handgun, as I crept towards the bedroom door. I wrapped my hand around the doorknob, just as a sound like a stove tipping over crashed across the house. I winced, wondering who the hell was making such a ruckus. It had to be some meth head or something. No burglar was that incompetent. I opened the door quietly and tiptoed through the living room, boxer shorts being my only covering. The noise had stopped after the loud crash, but I was taking no chances. The last thing I wanted was to get jumped on as I came around the corner. When I peeked around the edge of the bar, I could see a huge mess spread across the usually pristine kitchen. The refrigerator door was open, food and juice spilled everywhere, and the stove was indeed flipped on its face as it lay on the floor. Bakelite glass was scattered across the ground, and it added to the overall catastrophe that stretched across the kitchen. Of my intruder, however, there was no sign. I searched the house and found no one. The door was locked, front and back. None of the windows were open. It was clear that no one had broken in to trash my kitchen, and I could feel my anger flare up again as I looked at the disaster. Only one person could have been responsible for this, and he was currently pretending I didn't exist. This time, I hammered on the door. What the hell? You ruined the kitchen, wasted my food, and just scuttle back to your hole? Get your ass out here. You can help clean this shit up. Not a sound came from inside. I was furious. Did he think he could just wreck the house and ignore me? Who the hell did he think he was? He was on thin ice if this is the way he thought he was going to act. I thought about calling his grandmother tomorrow to see if he could stay there for a little while. He was 17 after all, and if he wanted to act like an idiot, I was tempted to call the police, let him spend the night in jail if that's how he wanted to act. That's when I threw the door open and saw him lying there, his back to me as he lay under the heavy comforter. Get your ass up. You can help clean up this mess, and then we're going to have a long talk about why it's not okay to destroy my kitchen. He still ignored me, giving me the literal cold shoulder. I took a step into the room, fists balled as I prepared to turn him over roughly and shout at him until he decided to listen. I stopped myself, though, after the first step. Maybe this was what he wanted. If I had considered that the police might solve my problems for me, then surely he had as well. He was hoping I would get rough with him so he could call and get me in trouble. Well, I was not about to play it right into his hands. I grabbed the chair from beside his door and wedged it under the knob just after I closed it behind myself. Good luck wrecking up the place now, asshole. I didn't sleep that night. I cleaned the kitchen before dragging myself back to bed just as the sun came up. I was filthy, sweaty, and smelled strongly of pine sol. The kitchen had taken a lot of work, and I fell into a filthy, thin sleep as I lay in my bed. My dreams were full of wrecked kitchens, thankless children, and lots of screaming. I slept poorly, despite my tiredness, and woke up grumpy and sore. I saw that the chair was still there when I walked to the bathroom and sniffed. He probably could have opened the door, but it would have taken a lot of shoving. His activities the night before had likely taken a lot out of him, and now he was too tired to get up, I suppose. Oh well, he'll get hungry sometime, and then he'll have to come talk to me. I showered, ate breakfast, and busied myself for the rest of the day. I kept listening for him, expecting him to curse as he discovered the chair, or to get up and flush the toilet, but he never made a peep. His room was quiet as a tomb, and he never so much as turned his TV on or walked to the bathroom. That should have raised some red flags for me, but I was still mad about the night before. If he wanted to starve in there, then let him starve. When it was finally bedtime, I crawled in gladly and was snoozing about the time my head hit the pillow. I heard the chair scrape harshly across the floor at about 11, and I climbed out of bed to go catch him leaving his room as the sounds became harsher. I got about halfway across the room when something hit the door hard enough to make it rattle in its frame. I took a step back, startled, waiting to see if it would knock it in or simply keep battering at it. After the sounds of breaking wood rattled across the room, I realized the something was the chair I had put under my son's door. After the chair shattered, it started battering the door with its fists, and I reached for the handgun on my nightstand and the phone on my charger. I dialed 911 and laid the phone against my ear, pointing the gun at the door steadily. I didn't want to shoot my son, but if it came down to it, I would do what I had to do. The operator picked up on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? I told them I needed some officers to come to my address. I told them my son was acting violently, possibly under the influence, and I desperately needed help. The officers could hear the sounds of something trying to batter my door in, and said she would dispatch help right away. She told me to stay on the line, and I did just that. My aim shook a little as something put a fist-sized hole in the door. The frame shook, and the surface bulged as whatever was trying to break it down tore through the first layer of the door and into the interior. I haven't prayed since my wife died, but I prayed to whatever God resided over all that he wouldn't make me shoot my child. I saw something crawl through the hole in the door frame and reach for the doorknob. I leveled my gun and prepared to fire if the door opened. It slid around the knob, and I heard it twist just before the lock caught. Thankfully, I had remembered to lock the door. It had fumbled at the simple turn lock when the first blue and whites flashed through the windows. The black thing retreated then, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. I snuck across the room to the door, gun leading as I peeked out into the hall. The hall was empty, the door to the living room still closed, and I shoved the door open noisily as it hung broken on its hinges. The police were banging on the front door, calling to see if anyone would let them in. I put my gun on the bookshelf by the door, not wanting to get shot by mistake. I called to them and let them know that I was the caller and I was opening the door. The door came open, and there they stood, hands on holsters, waiting to see who would open the door. They took in my boxer shorts and my scared face and asked me what had happened. I told them everything. I told them about the fight I'd had with my son. I told them about how he'd been in his room for days on end, only coming out at night to eat or cause trouble. I told them about the mess in the kitchen, even showed them some pictures I'd taken on my phone. I told them about the silent treatment we'd been engaged in for the last few days and how the night had simply been the icing on the cake. They agreed to come with me to talk to him. I knocked on his door, thinking I already knew what I'd find. There was no response. The cops looked at me skeptically, but I told them this was how it had been lately. I opened the door to find him turned away from me on the bed, blankets pulled up over himself, the same way he'd been the last time I'd seen him. Marcus, I said, trying to keep my voice even, you need to stop playing games and talk to these men. You went too far. My door is destroyed. You need to get up and tell these men what you did. Marcus said nothing. That's when I let my temper flare again, and I strode forward and yanked the blankets off the bed. Get the hell up and stop being such a child. I know you can... Then the blankets came away, and I saw the dried blood soaked into the mattress. It had soaked there, pooling on the floor beside the bed, and Marcus lay on his side with his eyes staring sightlessly at the wall. His body had begun to bloat, the skin darkening, and his wrists were jagged with rips all the way up to the arm. The knife he had used was still clutched in his hand, and the blade was dark with dried blood. After that, I spent several hours in the police station, shaking and trying to come to terms with what had happened. The cops hadn't put me in handcuffs. Professional courtesy, I suppose. But they had implied that they suspected this wasn't as cut and dry as it looked. I suspect that they thought I was attempting to cover up a murder, but when the coroner report came back, they determined that he'd been dead for a few days. The going consensus was that he had killed himself after our last fight. They found a note on his desk, and if they didn't already think I was a really shitty parent, that kind of sealed it. Not only had I essentially let my son kill himself and ignored him for 2 days, but I had driven him to it as well. The note he'd left said, "If you wish I had died in that crash so much, then let me just give you what you want. I'll be sure to tell Mom the reason that I'm here so soon. They cut me loose an hour ago, but all I can do is sit in my car and shake. Part of it is grief. I can't believe I have to go back to that empty house. I can't believe we'll never be able to put this all behind us and move on. I can't believe I'll never get to see him grow up and have kids of his own. I've lost everything now. My son, my wife, everything that made my house a home. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't fear there as well. Because if my son was dead, what was that thing that destroyed my kitchen and came after me tonight? It passed within a few inches of me that first night, and thinking back on that makes my skin crawl. The cops ignored me when I asked them what I was supposed to do about whatever had attacked me tonight. I know they think I'm making it all up, trying to garner some kind of sympathy for my negligence, but I know what I saw. I saw that long shadowy arm creep into the hole in my door. If it wasn't my son, then what the hell was it? As I sit in my car writing this, I don't know if I'll ever go home again. I don't even know if I have a home anymore. Good evening, my little creeperonis. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. If you like what you heard, come back Wednesday for one of my throwback stories. If you'd like to support the channel, there is a Patreon. We'd love to have your patronage. Or you can always buy a book on Amazon. I'll put the links below. Until next time, Dr. Plague, signing off.